It looked like the kind of life most people spend years trying to build, and even longer trying to protect. Dan Markel wasn't just another academic. He was the kind of person who stood out the moment you heard him speak. Sharp, articulate, confident, sometimes even intimidating. At Florida State University, he wasn't just teaching law, he was shaping how future lawyers think. His lectures weren't ordinary, they were intense, thought-provoking, and often left students questioning everything they thought they knew. Colleagues saw him as brilliant, students saw him as demanding but inspiring. And from the outside, his life followed a clear, structured path: education, career, recognition, family. The kind of life that looks stable, predictable, almost perfect. But perfection is often just what people see on the surface. Behind the achievements, behind the respect, behind the carefully built image, cracks had already started to form. His marriage to Wendy Adelson had ended, but what came after wasn't closure, it was conflict. Not the kind of quiet, respectful separation people hoped for. This was something else, something heavier, something that didn't fade with time, but instead grew more intense with every passing day. Because this wasn't just about two people going their separate ways. It was about control, it was about power, and most of all, it was about their children. At the center of everything was a decision that would turn a personal disagreement into a full-scale legal and emotional war. Wendy wanted to leave Tallahassee and move back to Miami, where her family lived. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. A mother wanting to be closer to her support system, a fresh start after a failed marriage. But for Dan, that decision meant something entirely different.
It meant distance. It meant losing time with his children. It meant watching his role as a father slowly shrink, not because he chose to, but because circumstances would force it, and he wasn't willing to let that happen. So instead of stepping back, Dan stepped in, hard. He turned to the law, the very system he had mastered, and began fighting back with precision. Legal filings, objections, court battles, every move carefully calculated, every argument designed to stop one thing: the relocation of his children. What might seem like a disagreement between two parents quickly escalated into something much bigger. The courtroom became a battlefield. Every decision carried weight, every ruling added pressure, and with every passing hearing, the tension between both sides didn't just remain, it intensified. But here's where things start to shift, because this conflict wasn't isolated between Dan and Wendy anymore. There were signs, subtle at first, that other voices were involved, other influences shaping decisions behind the scenes, conversations happening outside courtrooms, emotions being amplified, not calmed. What began as a custody dispute started to feel like something deeper, more personal, more emotional, more complicated. And when families get involved in already fragile situations, things don't always move toward resolution. Sometimes they move in the opposite direction. From the outside, none of this was obvious. Dan Markel still showed up to work, still delivered lectures, still engaged with colleagues, still lived what appeared to be a normal, structured life. If you saw him walking across campus, you wouldn't think anything was wrong. You wouldn't see the pressure building behind the scenes. You wouldn't feel the weight of the ongoing battle he was fighting every single day. Because some conflicts don't show themselves publicly. They build quietly, slowly.
Until one day, they reach a point where everything changes. The disagreement over relocation wasn't just a legal issue anymore. It had become emotional, personal, deeply rooted in frustration, resentment, and a desire for control. Neither side was willing to back down. Neither side was willing to lose. And in situations like this, when pride, family, and emotions collide, the outcome is rarely simple. What no one realized at the time was just how far this conflict would go. Because this wasn't just the story of a divorce. It wasn't just about custody, and it wasn't just about two people who couldn't agree. It was the beginning of something much darker, something that would eventually shock an entire nation. A story where a perfect life slowly turned into a nightmare no one saw coming. July 18, 2014 started like any other normal morning. There were no warning signs, no sense that anything was about to go wrong. The city of Tallahassee was calm, quiet, just another routine day. And for Dan Markel, life appeared to be moving forward as usual. He went about his day like he always did, structured, disciplined, predictable. The kind of routine you build when your life revolves around work, responsibility, and purpose. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing felt different. But sometimes, the most dangerous moments are the ones that feel completely ordinary. Because while Dan was living his normal routine, someone else was watching, waiting, tracking his movements. Not randomly, but deliberately. This wasn't chance. This wasn't coincidence. This was preparation. At some point that day, Dan returned home, a place that should have been the safest place in the world, a place where no one expects danger. No noise, no chaos, just the quiet comfort of routine. He pulled into his driveway, parked his car, and stepped out. And in that moment, everything changed. Without warning, without confrontation, without a single second to react. Gunshots. Sudden, loud, controlled.
It happened fast. Too fast for anyone to understand what was going on. Too fast for Dan to defend himself. Too fast for neighbors to process what they were hearing. This wasn't a robbery. Nothing was taken. This wasn't an argument. No words were exchanged. This was something else entirely. A targeted attack. A calculated execution. Dan was shot in his own garage, at his own home, a place that should have been secure, violated in the most brutal way possible. The attackers didn't hesitate. They didn't linger. They didn't panic. They came with one purpose, and the moment that purpose was fulfilled, they were gone, just like that. Within seconds, the scene went from silence to chaos. Emergency responders were called, neighbors were shaken, confusion spread quickly. How does something like this happen in broad daylight, in a quiet neighborhood, to someone like Dan Markel? He was rushed to the hospital, critically injured. Doctors fought to save him. Every second mattered. Every effort was made. But the damage was too severe, and soon after, Dan Markel was pronounced dead. Just like that, a respected professor, a father, a man with a structured life and future plans, was gone. No warning, no explanation, just questions. And those questions came fast, because nothing about this felt random. There were no signs of forced entry, no missing valuables, no personal dispute happening at the scene, no indication that this was a crime of opportunity. Everything pointed to one chilling possibility. This was planned, carefully, precisely, professionally. Investigators quickly realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary case. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a spontaneous act of violence. The timing, the execution, the escape, it all suggested something far more organized. Someone had been watching Dan. Studying his routine, waiting for the perfect moment when he would be most vulnerable. And when that moment came, they acted. Clean, fast, effective. The kind of precision you don't see in random crimes. The kind of precision you see in something much darker. A hit. And as the investigation began, one terrifying question started to take shape. Who would want Dan Markel dead badly enough to plan something like this? Because murders like this don't just happen, they're ordered. And somewhere out there was the person who made that decision. At first, the murder of Dan Markel looked like a mystery with no clear direction. No witnesses who could identify the attackers, no immediate suspects, no obvious motive visible at the crime scene. Just a clean, calculated killing that left behind more questions than answers. But investigators knew one thing for sure. Crimes like this don't just happen randomly. They leave patterns. And if you follow those patterns carefully enough, they lead somewhere. So instead of looking only at the crime scene, investigators widened their focus. They started digging into phone records, financial transactions, relationships, connections, every small detail that might seem meaningless on its own, but could reveal something bigger when put together. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. It didn't point to a single person.
It pointed to a network, a hidden chain of individuals, each playing a role, each connected in ways that didn't seem obvious at first, but became impossible to ignore once uncovered. At the center of this network was someone unexpected, Catherine MacBanya. She didn't look like a mastermind. She didn't look like someone capable of orchestrating violence. On the surface, she appeared ordinary, but investigators soon realized she was the link, the bridge between two very different worlds. On one side, a personal, emotional conflict. On the other, something much darker, the criminal underworld.
Through Catherine, the investigation led to two men, Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. These weren't random individuals. These were men with criminal backgrounds, men who understood violence, men who didn't act without reason or without payment. And suddenly, the pieces started to fit. This wasn't a spontaneous act. This wasn't a personal confrontation that got out of control. This was organized, planned, executed with purpose. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline, step by step. Phone calls placed before and after the murder, locations tracked, movements analyzed. Every detail added another layer to the story. And what they uncovered was chilling. The killers didn't just show up that day by chance. They had been in Tallahassee before, possibly more than once, driving around, observing, learning Dan's routine, identifying the perfect moment to strike. This wasn't rushed. This was preparation, careful, patient, deliberate preparation. And after the murder, the connections didn't just disappear. Money started moving, communication continued, and that's where things began to unravel. Because in cases like this, no matter how careful people try to be, mistakes happen. A phone call at the wrong time, a message that shouldn't have been sent, a connection that shouldn't exist. And those small mistakes, they're everything investigators need. As pressure built, one of the key figures, Luis Rivera, eventually became the turning point. Faced with the weight of the evidence, he chose to cooperate. And when he started talking, everything changed. He confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. This was a murder for hire, a planned hit, carried out by people who were hired to do one job, and one job only: kill Dan Markel. And just like that, the mystery shifted. It was no longer about what happened. It was about who ordered it.
Because if these men were hired, then someone, somewhere, made the decision. Someone funded it. Someone wanted Dan Markel gone badly enough to turn a personal conflict into a deadly conspiracy. And the deeper investigators dug, the closer they got to a truth that was far more disturbing than anyone expected. Up to this point, the case already felt disturbing. A respected professor murdered in broad daylight. A network of criminals hired to carry out the hit. But what investigators uncovered next didn't just add another layer to the story. It changed everything. Because the question was no longer how the murder happened. The real question became who wanted Dan Markel dead badly enough to pay for it. And when investigators followed the money, followed the connections, followed the relationships, all roads began to lead somewhere unexpected. Not to a gang, not to a random enemy, but to a family, the Adelsons. A family that on the surface looked successful, educated, and well-established. Nothing about them screamed violence. Nothing about them suggested involvement in something this extreme. And yet, the deeper investigators looked, the harder it became to ignore the connections. At the center of this growing suspicion was Charlie Adelson, a successful dentist, well-spoken, intelligent, someone who, just like Dan, came from a professional background. But unlike Dan, Charlie's name kept appearing in places it shouldn't. Phone records, financial links, indirect connections to the very people who carried out the murder. At first, these links seemed thin, coincidentally even, but when placed together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. And then there was Donna Adelson, a protective mother, deeply involved in her daughter's life, strong opinions, strong influence. Investigators began to look at her not just as a bystander, but as someone who may have played a much larger role behind the scenes. Because when they revisited the motive, everything started to make sense in a chilling way. The custody battle, the failed attempt to relocate the children, the growing frustration.
For the Adelson family, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was personal, deeply personal. The idea that their daughter, Wendy Adelson, was stuck in Tallahassee, unable to move closer to them, unable to start over the way they wanted, it created pressure, tension, and possibly resentment.
Now imagine that frustration building over time, turning into anger, then into determination, and eventually into something far more dangerous. Because according to prosecutors, this wasn't just about emotion, it was about control. The theory was simple, but terrifying. Remove Dan Markel, and the problem disappears. No more legal barriers, no more court battles, no more restrictions. Wendy could move. The children could be closer to the Adelson family. Everything falls into place. But that solution came at an unthinkable cost. Because if this theory was true, it meant that this wasn't just a crime involving criminals. It was a crime rooted in family. Planned not in the shadows of the streets, but possibly within conversations, discussions, and decisions made behind closed doors. And what made it even more chilling, there was no direct, obvious moment where everything was clearly ordered. No single piece of evidence that said, this is where it began. Instead, it was a puzzle. A series of actions, communications, and connections that, when combined, painted a picture that was hard to ignore. A picture where a family's desire for control and resolution may have crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. And as investigators built their case, piece by piece, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about catching the people who pulled the trigger. It was about proving who stood behind them, who set everything in motion, who turned a family dispute into a deadly conspiracy. And as the spotlight moved closer to the Adelson family,
The case went from shocking to absolutely unthinkable. By the time the truth began to surface, the case of Dan Markel had already shocked the public. But what came next wasn't a quick resolution. It was a long, slow journey toward justice, filled with trials, delays, twists, and moments that made people question whether the full truth would ever come out. Because cases like this don't end with one arrest, they unravel over years. As investigators built their case, prosecutors faced a difficult challenge. It wasn't enough to prove that a murder had happened, that part was clear. The real challenge was proving the conspiracy, proving that this wasn't just the act of a few criminals, but part of something much bigger. And that required patience. Piece by piece, the legal system began to move forward. The first major breakthrough came through cooperation. Luis Rivera, one of the men directly involved, chose to testify. His decision changed everything. For the first time, the hidden story behind the murder started to come into the light, not as speculation, but as testimony from someone who was there. And with that, the dominoes began to fall. Sigfredo Garcia, identified as one of the shooters, was brought to trial. The evidence, combined with testimony, painted a clear picture of his role. He wasn't acting alone, and he wasn't acting randomly. He was part of a plan that led directly to the murder of Dan Markel. Then came Catherine Magmana, the link between the killers and the people behind them. Her trials became a focal point of the case. The first ended without a clear verdict, leaving the public uncertain. For a moment, it felt like the case might stall, like the truth might slip through the cracks. But prosecutors didn't stop. They regrouped, rebuilt, and pushed forward again. And eventually, the outcome changed. Convictions followed. And with each conviction, the story became clearer and darker. Because the focus was now shifting higher up the chain, toward the people who allegedly made it all happen. That's when the spotlight turned fully onto Charlie Adelson. His trial wasn't just another step, it was a defining moment. The courtroom became the stage where years of investigation, evidence, and theory were finally tested. Wiretaps, financial records, conversations, everything was brought forward. And when the verdict came, guilty. It sent a shockwave through the case.
Because it confirmed what many had suspected for years, that this wasn't just a crime carried out by hired men, but something orchestrated at a higher level. But even then, it wasn't over. Soon after, another dramatic turn. Donna Adelson was arrested. Not quietly, not routinely, but under circumstances that raised even more questions, allegedly attempting to leave the country as the pressure closed in. It felt like something out of a movie. A case that started with a single, brutal act had now grown into a full-scale legal saga involving multiple trials, multiple convictions, and a family at the center of it all. And yet, even with all these developments, one question still lingers. What about Wendy Adelson? Her name has always been part of the story, always connected to the motive, always present in the background of everything that happened. But when it comes to legal accountability,
The answer isn't as clear. And that uncertainty is what keeps this case alive in people's minds. Because justice in cases like this isn't always simple. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in stages, sometimes incomplete, sometimes leaving behind questions that may never be fully answered. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the crime itself, it's the complexity of everything that followed. The years of investigation, the layers of conspiracy, the idea that something so calculated could remain hidden for so long. And even now, as convictions have been made and the legal system continues to move forward, the case of Dan Markel doesn't feel finished. Because when a story involves power, family, and secrets this deep, there's always the possibility that not everything has been revealed, and that somewhere within everything we know, there are still pieces missing.